You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 150. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my dear friend. Welcome back to the podcast, and thank you. Thank you for joining me here today to celebrate in this milestone podcast episode 150. I cannot believe that it has been nearly 3 years since I first started recording this podcast for you, and I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you. Thank you for tuning in every week. Thank you for sharing this podcast with your friends. Thank you for sharing your feedback with me about how this podcast has impacted you. It means everything to me. And I'm thrilled to have you here for episode 150. I have a very special guest who is joining us today. She was actually the very first guest that I had on this podcast, and she is my near and dear friend, Mylène Houle Morency. Mylène is a professional organizer. She joined us at episode 25 about 2.5 years ago to talk about decluttering your workspace. And she's here today to talk about a different topic. We are talking about mental load and mental overload. And Mylène is going to walk us through what they are, mental load, mental overload. She's going to talk about what characteristics make somebody susceptible to slipping from having a mental load to having a mental overload. And she's going to offer practical solutions to help you if you find yourself slipping into that overload state. Now, as you listen to the episode, I would encourage you to think about what it is that you have on your plate right now, what you are juggling, and how this concept applies to you, and how the tools that Mylène is offering are ones that you could use to help you in your practice. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome the recording of my interview with Mylène, and just wanted to say again, thank you again for joining me, for joining us. It is a pleasure to have you here. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm thrilled to have you here today to join me for episode 150. And for this very special landmark episode, I'm thrilled to be having a return guest. Her name is Mylène Houle Morency. Mylène is one of my nearest and dearest friends. She lives in Montreal, Quebec. She is a professional organizer. She's absolutely delightful. And she was also the very first guest who ever appeared on the podcast. So thrilled to have her back. That was in November 2021, if you can believe it. And in the 2.5 years since she first came on the podcast, Mylène has been very busy. She's had her own television show, which is absolutely out of this world. It's called Heureux Rangement. It literally translates to happy organizing. And it's kind of like a home edit style show where she was organizing celebrity homes in Quebec, which is so fantastic. And she's also written a book, and the book is called S'organiser pour de bon, which was published with Les Éditions de l'Homme. And it's basically a book that teaches you how to create your organization systems so that you can stick to those systems, so that you create them and they stay in place. So with all of that, I would love to introduce my dear, dear friend, Mylène. Mylène, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Paula. I can't believe 150 episodes. I remember back when you were just brainstorming about the whole concept, and here we are nearly 3 years later. So congrats.
Thank you so much. Well, and it's been such a joy, right, to have guests like you to come onto the podcast and to share the messages that you have and all the learning that you have with the listeners who I know are going to be really interested in learning more about today's topic, which of course is mental load and mental overload, what those are and what we can do about it. So before we dive into that, I'd love to hear a little bit more of an update in terms of what you do, because I know we did this a few years ago, but things have shifted for you a little bit. So would love to hear about some of the projects that you're involved in and what you're doing these days.
Yeah, gladly. So essentially, With flow organization, I've taken a greater B2B, so business to business turn, where I'm giving a lot of seminars in the workplace, trainings in the workplace to do with mental load and directly also on work-life balance. So how do we get ourselves organized, whether it's in the home or even with this new complex world that we're navigating with hybrid work from home and work at the office. So I've been training people to find their way through that and find a way to feel balanced and have those two spheres integrate. With the book publication, I'm also giving a lot of seminars in libraries and still doing some in-home organizing, some corporate organizing too, which is a new thing that I've added on. And yeah, essentially doing all of that and having a nice mix of multi-passionate business here.
I love it. And you showed me some pictures the other day from what I believe is your corporate organizing, and it
Yeah.
was mind blowing. It was basically a mail room where there were folders and things just kind of everywhere in the
Yeah.
before picture, right?
Yeah.
And then the after picture was just this beautiful, serene looking office room or mail room with everything, clear surfaces and color coded file cabinets and just things that are so exciting for those of us who get really, really happy when we see organized spaces. So anyways,
It's good for the soul.
it's good for the soul. And I'm hoping to see more of those pictures because they make me very happy. And I just mentioned that you were on the podcast, episode 25. Back then you were talking about organizing your home office space, right? That's when we were fairly, I guess not that early on into the pandemic, maybe about 2 years in, and people had basically adopted this hybrid working style. So that was something that you really helped out with. And now it sounds like at least one of the things that you're doing is this discussion about mental load. So would love to hear from you. What is mental load? And also what is mental overload?
Yeah. So mental load is essentially the invisible work that we keep on top of and we keep in mind as we're navigating, whether it's our personal life or whether it's our professional life. All of these things that often don't find themselves on a to-do list. And even the to-do list, sometimes how do we share that between two people? So what I'm finding is, especially post-pandemic, people have found a tipping point and are often on the other side onto the mental overload space because they've got so much to keep track of. It's a fast-paced world right now. We are having to deal with a lot of new and changing ways of doing life. And so whether we've got families or not, we're having to compose with that. And our stress levels when we talk about mental overload, we're talking about excessive stress that's beyond optimal stress, really.
Beautiful. And can you give some examples of what types of things create mental overload? Like what things might be on your mind that kind of start to pile up?
Yeah, absolutely. So having to keep on track of all of the to-dos, whether it's to do with our business. So when we're asking our brain to retain all of the things that we must do instead of actually writing it down on paper. So when I'm thinking about my business, it's returning certain emails and making sure to get back to people that have reached out to me. And the main challenge with our reality today is things are coming from various channels. So we've got incoming email and text messages and various social media platforms. So keeping some kind of an overview of everything and centralizing it into a certain way, whether we're paper or whether we're a more virtual person, finding the right kind of container to have an overview and put it all in one place is really what will help. And also using the Eisenhower matrix, knowing what is not necessarily important or urgent so we can get that even off the list.
Beautiful. And Mylène, as you know, I just got back from family vacation.
Yeah.
I was in California with my family, which was amazing. But even I find planning for a family trip, right? My husband very delightfully took care of hotel and accommodation. Well, I guess that's the same thing. Hotel, he took care of the flights and everything. But there's still so much that goes along with that, right?
Absolutely.
Like just getting all the kids packed up, making sure everybody had what they needed, kind of keeping track of what we're going to be using and when, what needs to get done at work before we hop on the plane because I'll be somewhat disconnected for a few days, meal planning ahead of time, meal planning for when we get back. So there are so many things. Exactly. So it's kind of like, when you say mental overload, I think, well, mental load and mental overload in my life, my mind immediately jumps to my family because I think that's where there's three other humans that I'm in a lot of ways responsible for.
Yeah.
And then there's the work component of it. And then there's,
Having to
other
juggle.
less high prioritized things that I would also like to have in my life. But exactly, trying to juggle all of those things. So I think it's one of those topics that is hugely valuable for all of us to be thinking about, because for each of us, our mental overload profile is going to look different. But I imagine for everybody listening, they are thinking right now in their minds of the to-do list, whether they're written down or they're kind of kept in their minds, about all the different things that need to get done. And so I'm thrilled that we have this chance to talk about it and to figure out what some systems and strategies can be so that we feel less overloaded.
Absolutely.
I guess. So, Mylène, you and I were talking about this before we planned the podcast, and you were saying that there's almost like a profile, like a type of person who's most at risk of crossing over from the load, which I gather is a relatively normal thing. We're all going to carry some
A
element
healthy
of
level of stress. Yeah.
beautiful and some element of load. And then we shift over into this idea of like overload. And so what are the characteristics, or who do you find is most at risk of shifting from that mental load into the mental overload category?
Yeah, absolutely. So those four main characteristics are people that have more of a perfectionistic tendency, people that are expecting a lot from themselves. The second is a person who is quite optimistic about how much they can get done in a certain amount of time. So they're willing, or they're kind of projecting they'll be able to do a lot more than that, what is really being able to be done. Anticipatory anxiety is the third component, where people are ready for plan B, C, D, E, and F. I mean, if this happens, this is how I'm going to be reacting to it, and so on and so forth. That's requiring a lot from our brain to kind of always be on the lookout. And finally, negative self-talk is, just constantly judging, of course. The way I'd apply it to me is, of course, there you go again, Mylène. You've accepted one more volunteer responsibility for the kids' school without looking at it. So kind of hitting yourself as you go, which is definitely not helpful.
Absolutely. And I really want to pause here, Mylène, because this composite, right?
Yeah.
I think so many of us can relate to it. I think so many women lawyers can relate to so many of these characteristics, right? This idea of the perfectionistic tendencies, wanting to do everything, A++ standards, optimistic in terms of how much we can take on. Oh, that is like one of
That hits
my
home.
Achilles heels, right? It's like, oh yeah, future me is sometimes looking back on past me saying, how did you really expect to get all of this done? And then this anticipatory, the way you described it, the anticipatory anxiety, I love my mother. I think I may have received this gift from her, but there's always that plan B, plan C. Well, if this doesn't work, then we'll do that. If, meal planning for the kids, if they're not going to eat this, then we'll eat that. And there's like a cascade of different options. And then finally that negative self-talk, right? And I think that's something I know for myself. I've been working on that for years now. And I see it a lot in the lawyers that I work with, right? The internal dialogue can be so brutal. And so you take all these other factors, and then, here's somebody, they're trying so hard. They're trying to do the best job possible. They're planning for all the contingencies.
Yeah.
They really want to be helpful, which is probably why they're taking things on in the first place. And then instead of giving themselves like a pat on the back or a bit of compassion, it's like, oh, and it's all your fault.
Yeah, exactly.
You never should have said yes in the first place. So yeah, no, I think these are really key to focus on, because I think they're so relatable.
Absolutely. And if I may, the other thing about those four components, it's usually really great to have one of those people on our teams. Like, if you've got somebody who has high expectations of themselves, you know that they're going to be delivering A+ work. And if they're always ready for plan B, C, and D, it's really nice because you can kind of rely on them. And, if they're optimistic about what they can get done, they're much more likely to accept, when you're asking them for help, they'll readily accept it. So all of those things, if it's applying to you, then keep on listening. But also, if you can kind of spot people in your surroundings, also keep on listening, because you'll get some really great tips on how to help people in your workplace.
This is so true, Mylène. And it's actually something that has come up in some of the coaching conversations that I've had with lawyers, where they find themselves filling that role, right? The person that people can turn to at any time, who will get the job done at the last minute. And that's fine, right? I think if we want to do that as part of our practice, to be able to be that person who's really helpful, but it's that threshold, right? It's are you doing that to the point where you can no longer sustain it? Are you doing that to your own detriment? And so I think it's really important for us to recognize it and to realize, okay, this is something that maybe is a pattern or a habit, and do I want to keep doing this? And if not, what are some options? So super, super helpful. The next question I have for you is about the costs, right? So if, we're trying to assess, is this mental load? Is this mental overload? What are some of the red flags that we might be wanting to watch out for?
So, red flags is how impactful it's going to be on our cognitive sphere, on our psychological sphere, and on our physiological sphere. So, if I go deeper into each of those from a cognitive standpoint, when we feel like we're in a mental fog, our concentration is affected, or really having a hard time keeping track of all of those balls in the air, our memory, like you're trying to recall, I just did something I tried to remember, and now I can't even remember even what I had for dinner last night. Like that's kind of a bit of a sign. From a psychological standpoint, when you are more susceptible to, you might have a peak of anger or a peak of sadness and you don't really recognize yourself. You can see a before and an after that when you're in mental overload, you are much more likely to have those peaks in emotions. And finally, usually people start paying attention to it when it's physiological. So if you've got chronic headaches that keep on coming back, if you've got, a cold, we were talking about colds right now, maybe we might want to be looking into that. But I mean, and we've all been dealing with colds all winter, but when your immunity is impacted by that stress, because there's a direct relation between the cortisol and the physiological impacts, usually that's when people start paying attention to it. And then they trace back, oh, you're right. From a psychological and cognitive standpoint, I can say I'm also affected.
Yeah. And that's, I think, three really helpful ways of looking at it. And just in terms of, I guess it's your overall feeling, right? Like you're kind of forgetting things, you don't feel yourself, and then it starts to manifest in physical elements. I imagine that would also include things like maybe migraines or insomnia or
insomnia in so many different ways, like whether it's falling asleep the moment you put your head on your pillow and then having episodes where you wake up for longer than an hour where you're thinking about everything that you need to do for the next day. Or sometimes it's you go to bed and you can't fall asleep for fear of forgetting things. And the third kind is having multiple moments where you're waking up for longer than an hour at night and you've got those things that you're mulling over. So insomnia is a big, big one. Thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah. And that just has such a huge impact on every other aspect, right? I think we can all relate to having not enough sleep and just the effect that that has overall. So yeah, and to trace all this back to this idea of mental overload, mental load is really helpful, again, because now we can actually think about, well, how are we going to solve for this? So another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is something that you and I have talked about in our conversations, is this idea of tasks, right? And how we have these to-do lists, we have these things that we're going to execute, but it's not just the execution of the task, that there's more to it than that. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so if you just think about the task, there's the logistics of things where you need to basically plan for it, think about it, see who else or what else might be involved before you execute it. So that's kind of, we have a tendency to think that mental overload is just a superposition or a juxtaposition of all of the things that we need to do, both in our personal and professional life, and that leads to mental overload. In reality, each task has the logistics component of doing it, but there's also the internal dialogue. So we might have the exact same task of getting our accounting done for our business or meal planning in our personal life. And if I love meal planning, my cognitive load or my mental load isn't going to be as heavy as somebody else who hates cooking, because all of a sudden it's, there's a few things. It's how do I like it? Also, what is my expected level of delivery on that task versus what is the actual outcome? So all of these things add to that internal dialogue. And so if you have a negative outlook on the thing in the first place, then definitely it'll be a heavier mental load than if you're going into it with, joy in your heart and ready to take on the task.
Well, and it's very interesting because I can see that happening in different contexts, right? If you're looking at it from again, I'm a mom, I've got the kids, part of my vacation was I decided to do laundry while we were still on vacation, so I would have less laundry. So on the topic of
Yeah.
loads, I did 5 loads of laundry in the last 2 days of our vacation, which I thought was going to be really helpful. It was obviously helpful, but I still have probably multiple loads. So there's the task, there's the
Never
thinking
ending.
about it. When am I going to do it?
Yeah.
Okay, we were at a place where the laundry was in a different faculty or facility, so I had to make
Yeah.
sure I wasn't leaving the laundry in the laundry machine for too long. So set my
Yeah.
phone, go back and forth, etc. So there's the planning involved, there's the execution. I don't mind laundry, so I don't think I had too much of that load factor. But then there's also in the professional context, I know that I could 100% relate to this when I was practicing law and still now sometimes. But I think when you're working on a project, for example, where maybe you're doing it for the first time, you don't know how to do it, you're finding it really challenging. There's a really heavy load,
Hmm.
relatively speaking, compared to something where you've done it a million times, you know what to expect, you feel really confident. It might be that you're working with somebody who has really high expectations and maybe difficult to work with. And so you're
Yeah.
anticipating that they're going to come back to you and they're going to be critical or they're not going to like it or they're going to say something that's going to upset you or
Hmm.
so there's that. I can see how that internal dialogue, right, that accompanies the task, right? You look at the
Yeah.
task, it's a bullet point on a piece of paper, but
Hmm.
it's actually there's so much more to it than that because there's that internal narrative that
Yeah.
accompanies the task itself. So that's such a great point that I don't think we really think about when
No.
we're looking at our to-do lists.
No. And if we think about the legal world, I'm not as familiar as you are with it, but I think of billable hours. And in that internal dialogue, it's how much time is this going to take and how many other things do I need to get done? And with regards to billable hours, like you might be able to shed some light on that for me, but that can really increase the mental load if you know that you've got 4 different files to look at for the rest of the day and you've got a certain amount of billable hours that you need to get into, onto your sheets. So that could also add to the mental load, definitely.
Absolutely, because everything that you do as a lawyer is being tracked in the billable hour. And
Hmm.
so as you're working on your task, you're thinking, okay, can I bill for this? Can I justify this billable hour?
Right.
Am I on track? Am I doing what needs to be done? Am I spinning my wheels? At the end of the day, are you on target for your
Hmm.
yearly targets based on what you need to do every day, et cetera? So absolutely, it's like this running narrative in the background. It's a great example because it's always there. It's kind of like an
Yeah.
open tab on your computer. It's always there. You're kind of
Yeah.
thinking about it. And so it's again this idea of the additional load that accompanies the task.
Totally.
It's a great example. Thank you. So, Mylène, what happens? Like you've talked about some of the effect, the cognitive signs, the physiological signs, and the psychological signs.
Hmm.
So, you find that maybe you're drifting into this, you're crossing over from that mental load threshold into the mental overload. What happens, like if you stay there for too long?
Oh, definitely chronic stress is going to be part of your reality, and definitely you'll have to be paying the price of that. So what we want to be doing is sort of catch ourselves and be aware of the mechanism. I really like to go back into the fight or flight response to kind of help us have a better idea of, how that all works. And so if we're looking at the fight or fight response, there's basically 5 different steps. There's the stressful event that is sort of the trigger. And as we go through that, that stressful event goes through our perception. If we perceive that the event is stressful, that'll trigger a chemical reaction, which will then trigger a physiological reaction, and then we'll have a behavioral reaction. So if I actually give an actual example, if I were to I'll go for something where our life would be in danger. So if I like if I go face to face with a bear because I'm camping, then we all agree my perception is going to be perceiving that this is a stressful reaction. I'm going to be going into all of my memories about what I know about a situation like that, what I've read about it, what I've seen on TV, what people have told me about it. So once we determine that it's a stressful situation, that'll trigger a chemical response for us where we will be generating some cortisol, some adrenaline, that'll go through our veins. And that's usually when we have the physiological reaction. Our heart starts beating faster. Our breath is more shallow. We're trying to conserve energy. Our pupils are dilated. We've got a whole bunch of different things. And finally, because we're in front of a bear, we'll have the behavioral reaction where we'll decide to do whatever it is that we need to do in front of a bear. This is something that's really worth keeping in mind because, when we go past a deadline and realize that, we missed it and we dropped the ball, or even when we are interrupted by a colleague or by a client, our body doesn't have a way to kind of distinguish whether we're really in danger or not. And so for us to really have a way and sort of have levers on how to short circuit that reaction, we want to know what are the doors of entry to kind of short circuit that fight or flight response. So we could have fewer stressful events. This is where I come in when I talk about organization. Being more organized, whether it's in the workplace or in the home, decreases the number of stressful events. But we can also act on the lever of perception. My brain is telling me that it's a stressful reaction, whatever it is, the person who's interrupted me, the person who's taken credit for the work that I've done, whatever it is, or, I've missed a deadline. I can sort of go through it and decide to eliminate the number of events that I might find stressful. And I could keep on going at each of those different steps. But for today, I want to kind of stay around the perception because that's sort of where we have a lot of power. We don't necessarily have a way to decrease that many stressful events in the workplace. But if we can kind of work on our perception, especially through the lens of the three characteristics that I've given you at the beginning, not all four of them, but I'll go through perfectionism, anticipatory anxiety, and being very optimistic about how much things can get done in a certain amount of time. So that's sort of the empowerment of being able to say, you know what, I know I have a tendency to tip from mental load to mental overload, but let me get that power back and start putting some tools into action to decrease that.
Beautiful. And so how do you do that? Like, how do you help yourself? Like if you're finding yourself in this state, and I love how you described it, right? It's like the equivalent of seeing a bear, right?
Yeah.
Chances are, when you miss a deadline, it's not a life or death situation, but it feels that way. And
It
so
does.
what you're saying is that we have leverage in terms of how we perceive it and how we choose to think about it. So what exactly can we do?
Yeah. So, the first is the introspection of, did you recognize yourself, as I was mentioning, perfectionism, or very optimistic with regards to how much you can get done, or anticipatory anxiety? So maybe we could go through maybe a tool for each of those three and kind of go from there. So if we look at perfectionism, what I like to do with my clients that identify as perfectionists is to do a time audit with where their time is going. And usually I call it a done list, but you can call it whatever you'd like. So, and I also recommend people do that as a team because it's quite a hefty experiment to do. So you want to kind of pair up so that you know that you're going to go through to the end of that experiment. Essentially, you want to take 7 days that you'll be writing down, whether it's in 30-minute increments, maximum hour increments, from the moment you get up until the moment you go to bed, you write down everything. And also, how much sleep are you getting? Because usually when you're in mental overload, you have a tendency to cut back on the sleep that you're getting, which kind of has an effect, a long-term effect. So you'll be going through that for the 7 days. And usually what I like to do is print out, if you've been writing that up in an Excel spreadsheet, you print it out. If you're more of a paper person, you've probably been writing it into an agenda. So it's sort of a reverse agenda. Instead of writing what you will do, you're writing what you have done, and you go through it with a highlighter. So I like to go through everything that's related to work with a green highlighter. And when I'm talking about cash, green. And so obviously it's the time that you're spending on your work. But sometimes it's also when you're catching up on email once the kids have gone to bed, or if you take a phone call after work, or even if you're, talking about a certain case or a certain project with a client or with a coworker while you're driving back home. That has a tendency to add up and we sort of forget about it, but just to really understand where all of that time is going. So green highlighter for work. I usually use an orange highlighter with regards to our family tasks. So whether you've got a family or not, the household things, we all have to do laundry, we'll all have to meal plan and do the groceries. Those of us that have kids have rides to give to various sporting and cultural activities, homework to overlook, and so on and so forth. So everything that's related to the smooth running of the household is highlighted in orange. If you're involved in volunteer work, I like to use a separate highlighter because it could be for professional or private reasons. So I like to have it in a separate category to kind of also have an idea of, am I overcommitted in terms of volunteer work? So you could use a yellow highlighter. And some of us are continuing our education. So maybe you're taking credits for your profession, or maybe you're actually doing a certificate in university or in a college. So you could highlight that in blue. The time that's left over, obviously our sleep, but also our hobbies, is going to be highlighted in pink. So that really gives us a strong visual of where our time is going. And many of us are visual. So that's kind of usually a bit of not a bit of an impact. It's a huge impact for people to realize, oh my gosh, like no wonder I feel like I'm overtired and I've got mental overload because I've got so many things going on. I do want to talk about, oftentimes I can sort of even imagine people asking themselves the question, what about the overlap of things? Maybe I'm driving, you and I have that great example. Whether I am driving to a client in the morning or in the evening, so this is transportation, which would be more related to, say, whatever work or hobbies, but I'm also taking the time to speak with a friend on the phone. You and I do that often. That would be, I call it brown time, because it's mask time where you've got a superposition of two different activities that leads to kind of two things happening at once. So that's also a telltale sign of us trying to be overproductive. If we've got too much of that brown time where we're doing two types of activities at the same time, we want to be mindful of that, because oftentimes, I think in our case, I know that is something that's very positive because it's really good for our mental health, for both of us to be connecting and discussing things together. But sometimes that masked time can be overproductive and can also drain us. So that's something to be really mindful of. So that's sort of the beginning of the done list. And then you can sort of go through it and understand, okay, am I having enough of that pink time for myself? Do I have time for myself, for my hobbies, for my friendships? Am I going out with my spouse on a regular basis? Or do I have so little time left over for myself that I'm even cutting back on sleep? I'm going to bed late because I'm catching up on work. I'm getting up early. Do you have time to work out? Like, all of that should be highlighted in pink. And oftentimes when we're looking at mental overload, there is a definite lack of pink on that done list.
Beautiful. That is so helpful. And I think the highlighter example is particularly relevant if I think back to my law school days and even into practice. Having a different colored highlighter for different themes totally resonates. And I think when you can actually see on a sheet of paper all the activities that you have done, right? It is a done list, and how the colors align with your values too, right? Like you value that pink time and you see that there's actually very little pink time there. Or if you think you're working all of the time, but when you see it on paper, it's actually less work and maybe some more brown or some other color on that sheet. I think that's really eye-opening. You mentioned at the beginning, Mylène, starting with perfectionism. Do you find that for perfectionists, there's a certain profile in terms of the colors, or you're nodding your head? So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I find that for my perfectionist clients, there's just a lack of pink generally because they're only allowing themselves to have the crumbs of what's left over of their time. So they're overextended oftentimes. They want to do things so well that, they will use up every spare minute and they'll go beyond. So that's usually something, and a lot of brown, because they're trying to do so many things at once that it's productivity takes over the importance of slow living that's so essential when we want to live that balanced life. We want to have that optimal stress generally, but we also need to recharge our batteries with rest and with doing one thing at a time and fully being in the present moment.
Beautiful. And you just said, right, that optimal level of stress, because I think what you're saying isn't so much we're not going to have a mental load. We're not going to have stress in our lives. It's that we're trying to pay attention to the levels so that it's a healthy level of stress. It's a healthy level of load, not this kind of chronic stress, overloaded situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when people hear about this, they look on their lives and they think, okay, like I've got too much stress. How do I cut back so much that there is as little as possible? And really, when you think about the times that you were most proud of yourself in your life, whether it is that you signed up for a 5K or a 10K, or you got that promotion at work, or whatever it is that when you look back, for me, it was definitely when I wrote my book. I wasn't in an absence of stress situation, but I was at the peak of my creativity, of my performance. So there was that nice, healthy level of optimal stress that brought out the best in me. But it can often be very close for certain people, that tipping point to go from optimal to overload. So being mindful of what is the distinction for you and knowing, I mean, I often show a graph of Yerkes and Dodson. I don't know if we can even refer to it in the show notes, but for people to know, every people around the room when I'm giving a seminar on this has a different graph. Our level of optimal stress is different. And that's why I might be overreacting to something that a colleague of mine would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's not that stressful. But it's having that self-compassion, that to know, okay, this is how I react and it's fine. How do I put in place certain good habits to help me to bring myself back to optimal stress, to feel like I'm not constantly triggering my nervous system to be in fight or flight mode?
Beautiful. And one thing that I think that a number of my clients have shared with me is this idea that, there are certain periods of practice that are going to be more intense, right? You
Yeah.
mentioned writing a book.
Yeah.
So the equivalent might be a big deal or a
Mm-hmm.
court hearing, or, maybe it's a really stressful file that just keeps on kind of exploding, right? There are certain
Yeah.
things that will be triggering within somebody's professional work. And so having an eye to that, right? Knowing, okay, maybe this is something that will wrap up in a couple of weeks. So I
Yes.
can manage my stress for that period of time. Or, I know I need to take extra good care of myself because it's going to be particularly stressful. So I think, as you're saying, right, everybody's going to have a different level of stress that they can handle comfortably. And
Yeah.
everyone has a different profile about what's going to be stressful within their professional work and also at home potentially. So
Absolutely. I
yeah,
completely agree.
I love that. So what other strategies you mentioned? So this is wonderful. We can do a time audit. I love that. I think
Yeah.
I do record my done list. So I think I have to go back with my highlighter and see where I'm spending my time. What else do you recommend?
So there is a psychologist here in Quebec. Her name is Sonia Lupien, and she has a really helpful acronym for identifying sources of stress. So I'm going to read it out loud and then go into it. In French, it's la règle de ciné. In English, it's when you're stressed, don't go nuts, with the acronym being nuts. So there's 4 triggers that will instigate a state of stress. The N is for novelty. The U is for unpredictability. The T is for threat to the ego, and the S is for sense of control. So if we're in a given situation and one or more of those levers are activated, we will for sure go into a stressful response. And I find that for people that have anticipatory anxiety, knowing what those triggers are really helpful. So you could even do on the back of an envelope, you know, this situation happened. What was it that triggered me? And we all sort of have a different profile. That's helpful for us to know as an introspective activity, but it's also helpful for us to know within our team members at work who is more triggered by what. So it won't be any surprise for people to know that as a professional organizer, my trigger is not having a sense of control. So that's generally, and I know that if there's a situation in which I don't have control, going into it, I can sort of prepare myself and be like, okay, you know what, Mylène, this is most likely to happen. And having myself prepared kind of short circuits that fight or flight response because I'm sort of ready for it. In the same way, for my son, who my youngest, doesn't like to have unpredictability. If I know something is coming and there's, some kind of a change going, preparing him more than the 2 other kids is going to be really helpful. So no matter what kind of a team we're talking about, whether it's the family team or the workplace team, knowing what our triggers are, what the triggers are of other people will sort of reduce the anticipatory anxiety that we might feel.
Yeah, those are such great examples. Can you go through this again? So if it's novel,
Yeah.
what is it
So
again?
novelty. So N for novelty,
Yep.
U for unpredictability,
Yep.
T for threat to the ego, and S for sense of control.
Yeah. Yeah. I love those. And I think in any legal practice, there's going to be some element of that almost really for so many different examples in the workplace, right? Like
Yeah.
the file that comes to you where you don't know what to do, right? Like that it's a
Yeah.
brand new type of case, or, the law in that area is unsettled, or it's a brand new client and you're trying to figure out how to work with them. And so you
Yeah,
can see it at work and you can see it at home too, right? Our
for
kids too,
sure.
right? You need to be giving them lots of structure, lots of heads up warning about what's going to arrive next. And the idea of also being able to do that for yourself, I think, is quite nice, right? That
Yeah,
we can,
self-parenting.
yeah, basically,
Yeah,
and kind of knowing that if something is new, we're going to have that reaction. It's okay, right? If I
yeah,
feel stressed, that's fine. That's
that's
totally
part of
normal.
it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's
If
the
it's
human experience.
exactly. So I think it's really liberating to have these tools in place and to know, okay, nothing's gone wrong here. This is just to be expected, and I'm going to
Yeah.
help myself prepare for it by forecasting some of the obstacles that might show up.
Definitely. And I mean, if you look back and we rewind back to March 2020, the reason why the world was in such upheaval is that all four of those things were triggered, you know? It was completely novel. We'd never been in a lockdown situation. Many people were working from home when they hadn't been. It was completely unpredictable. Some of us thought we'd be going back to work in 2 weeks and everything would be done. And it kept on being extended and extended. The threat to the ego. What's going to happen to me? Am I still going to have a job in 6 months? Because what's going to happen to the economy? And basically, no sense of control, like thinking about masks and vaccines, all of those things. And just, I can't even send my kids back to school. And, threats to the ego was, who am I to be teaching my kids doing, work from our school from home when I don't feel like I'm equipped to do that? So no wonder we're dealing with so many different challenges right now with mental health because as a society, as the entire species, we were very much put to the test with this in all four of those aspects.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, these are such great tools. Any other recommendations in terms of how we can manage ourselves, from tipping from the load to the
Yeah.
overload?
So, with regards to people that are underestimating how much time it'll take for them to do certain tasks, it's really easy to let the weekend slip away because if you're underestimating a whole bunch of things that are important, you get to the end of the day and you don't have that much time left over for the fun part of it. So that's a really useful tip or tool to put into practice, especially for people that are a little bit more numbers minded and want to have something that's a little bit more tangible than the nuts thing, or not something that's a little bit less energy or energy requiring of the done list. This is something that's super easy to do, and once you have your actual coefficient, one thing that's really interesting is I've done this myself and I've done that a lot with clients. And I find that the coefficient of estimated time divided by, or real time divided by estimated time, is actually greater in our personal life than in our professional life. So generally, the number that I get to with my clients for the real time divided by estimated time is generally around 1.25 in the workplace. And so, how do we use that in real life? Like, it's great to have that number. But if I have a tendency to underestimate by 25% what I can get done in a workday, if I've got an 8 hour day, I want to be planning out 6 hours out of my day and be keeping as a buffer maybe an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon, knowing full well that most likely I'm going to go over the time that I've kind of planned for certain of my activities. And best case scenario, I've got an hour or 2 hours left over to keep on moving forward on other tasks that hadn't been planned for, maybe starting to do things that were planned for tomorrow. So that's kind of something that's really useful. In our personal life, I have a tendency to see more like a 2 to 2.25 of people that are thinking that things are going to get done a lot more quickly in their personal life. So that's something to keep in mind, even for planning weekends.
It's so helpful. I think it's really useful, especially if you're planning out your days for work and
Yeah.
planning out your weekends, as you mentioned, particularly for lawyers who are trying to figure out, like, how long is a particular task going to take. And so
Yeah.
when you are mindful of your estimate and then what it actually takes, I think you get so much better at estimating how long tasks will take, how long
Yes.
they should take. For junior lawyers, that can be really troubling because they don't know, having
Definitely.
never done a task before, they don't know
Hmm.
how long it's going to take. If it's a research task, you may not know in advance because you don't know how much law there is on that topic or how long the cases are going to be that you're going to need to read through. And so having just this idea of measuring your time, estimating your time, and then being able to see how the forecast aligns with reality is a really useful tool to gain awareness of
Yeah.
how you're using your time and how to plan more effectively.
Absolutely.
That's
Self knowledge is so important.
Beautiful. These are amazing strategies. So are there any other strategies that you have to share with us today on our podcast?
I mean, I could keep on going for hours, but we don't have hours of time in front of us. I think generally, once you've looked at that, also just general healthy lifestyle habits. So being aware of making sure you're getting enough, the usual things that everybody knows about, but few people actually practice, making sure you're getting enough sleep, making sure you are laughing enough in a day, because that endorphin is definitely a nice antidote to all of the adrenaline and the cortisol. Exercise to sort of finish that reaction of fight or flight so that you're burning up that adrenaline that you're generating regardless. We can't short circuit all of the fight or flight responses. So in that regard, just being more mindful of, in that pink time, are you getting the essential elements that are going to be helpful to making sure that you don't fall into the chronic stress loop over and over again?
Beautiful. I love that so much. And I think this was a theme also in our last podcast episode, right? I think this element of self-care, right? We go into this thinking we're talking about organization. We go into it talking about mental load and mental overload. And a theme throughout both of them, I think, really is to make sure that you're giving yourself what you need, right? That you're putting onto your calendar that pink space time for yourself. As you said, the sleep, the exercise, the laughter, the joy, making time for those things as much as possible, right? Maybe there's less time for that in those peak periods when work's really busy or there's lots going on with the family. But when those peak periods have come and gone, that you make sure that you spend that time on you, right? That
absolutely.
You do something that fills your bucket, right?
Absolutely. And just knowing what are those elements. Because for some people, I know that if I've got very little time, I should really focus on sleep, versus if I've got very little time, maybe another person would focus more on exercise. Knowing what those important levers are for our own well-being is important.
Beautiful. Amazing. Mylène, it has been so wonderful having you back. And thank you again for joining us. For anybody who would like to find you, learn more about you, learn more about how you could help them, right? With the mental load, with organization, with all of these things, where can people find you?
So the best way would be to connect with me through LinkedIn or directly on my website. My website's all in French, so LinkedIn is probably more user-friendly to the English population. But definitely, if you're looking to provide tools to a group of employees to do with mental load, but also more tangible and tactical systems to put in place with regards to organization, that's something that I love doing, transferring those tools to participants through virtual seminars or in-person seminars. I just absolutely love it. And since I'm bilingual, it's really nice because I can offer those tools to all of the employees across Canada, especially when we've got bilingual teams.
Amazing. And Mylène, you've mentioned a number of resources, including your own contact info. So we'll link to all of those things in the notes that come along with this episode for anybody who wants to check those out. So thank you again, Mylène. Episode 150 with my dear, dear friend, Mylène. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everybody for joining us, listening here today. It's been just such a treat to have you here and to talk about this really important topic that I think many of us can absolutely relate to.
Thanks, Paula.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.